All right, so we're diving into some pretty heavy stuff today, Project 2025. Um, it's this roadmap for education, but it's causing a lot of controversy.
Yeah, you could say that. It's definitely ambitious. Some might even say radical.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I mean,
Yeah.
we're talking phasing out Title I funding, maybe even scrapping the Department of Education entirely.
Oh, and don't forget the part about tying school funding to vaccine mandates. That's a whole other can of worms.
Right. So we've got our work cut out for us today.
For sure.
We're mainly looking at this document. It's called Education Under Siege.
The far right's vision for education explained.
Yeah, that's the one. It's written by the special ed teacher, Dr. Jaime Hoerricks, in Los Angeles.
So straight from the front lines.
Exactly. And, well, let's just jump right in. Universal school choice seems to be, like, the big thing everyone's talking about with Project 2025.
Yeah, it's basically this idea that parents get vouchers or these things called education savings accounts instead of money going directly to public schools.
Right. And they can use those to, pay for private schools, religious schools, or even homeschooling.
Yeah.
It's all about giving parents the power to choose, supposedly leading to better quality overall. At least that's what the proponents say.
Right, empowering parents, fostering competition.
But Dr. Herricks is, like, really concerned about what this could mean, especially for schools that are already struggling, like Title I schools.
Especially Title I schools, it's a valid concern could pull funding away from schools that need it the most.
Exactly. Creating this, like, two-tiered system where only wealthy families can afford, the good schools.
Yeah, a system where some kids are set up for success and others are left behind.
And you know what's kind of crazy? The person who wrote the education part of Project 2025, this woman, Lindsay Burke.
She's a researcher at the Heritage Foundation.
Right. And a fellow at EdChoice, which is all about promoting school choice.
So very much in line with this whole philosophy of limited government and parental control.
But the thing is, she's never actually taught in a classroom herself.
That does make you wonder how much they really understand the day-to-day realities of, well, teaching, especially in schools that are, under-resourced.
Yeah, like how connected are these policies to what's actually happening in schools?
Hmm.
And it's not just about school choice. They also want to completely eliminate Head Start.
Head Start, that program that's supposed to get kids ready for kindergarten.
Yeah, like early education, health services, family support,
Mm.
that kind of thing. It's supposed to help level the playing field for kids from low-income families.
There's a ton of research showing how beneficial it is.
Exactly. Kids who go through Head Start, they're more likely to graduate, get jobs, even earn more over their lifetimes.
It's about breaking cycles of poverty, giving kids a chance to thrive.
But Project 2025 just sees it as a waste of money.
Yeah, a line item to be cut. And it's like that with so many programs that are meant to help people who are struggling.
Right. Like Title I funding, that's huge for schools with lots of low-income students.
Provides extra support, resources, helps them hire more teachers.
Yeah, all the stuff they desperately need. But Project 2025 wants to phase that out completely.
And whatever little funding might be left would be tied to, guess what?
Standardized test scores.
You got it. Which honestly doesn't even make sense for a lot of these students.
Right. Those tests aren't designed for them. It would just end up punishing schools for trying to help the kids who need it the most.
Exactly. A school could be doing amazing work, making real progress with its students.
But then get penalized because their scores aren't high enough yet.
It makes you wonder what the real goal here is.
Okay, and then there's the big one. Abolishing the entire U.S. Department of Education.
That's a big one. Their argument is all about, reducing federal interference, giving more control back to states and local communities.
But wouldn't that just create chaos?
Yeah.
Like every state doing its own thing with no national standards. What about making sure every kid has equal opportunities, regardless of, race, gender, disability?
Those are some of the concerns, for sure. Could see a real backsliding on a lot of the progress that's been made towards equity in education.
It feels like they're trying to dismantle all the protections for vulnerable students.
There's definitely that element to it. And speaking of protections, they also want to weaken the Office for Civil Rights.
The OCR.
Yeah, the ones who investigate complaints about discrimination in schools.
Oh, right.
If they're weakened or even eliminated, it could be really bad.
People would be less likely to report discrimination if they don't think anything will be done about it.
Exactly.
And that's especially dangerous for, marginalized communities.
The ones who are already facing so many barriers.
Wow. We've barely scratched the surface here.
Yeah, and we haven't even touched on the proposed cuts to special education funding.
Or that whole vaccine mandate thing.
And then there's the cultural stuff, what they're calling curriculum changes.
Oh, right. The part about controlling what's actually being taught in schools.
That's a whole other. Well, yeah, we'll definitely need to unpack that.
All right, deep breaths, everyone. We'll be right back after this.
It's kind of scary, actually, how much of Project 2025 seems to be about, targeting programs that help students with disabilities. Like we were talking about the Office for Civil Rights, but then there's the whole thing about cutting funding for IDEA.
Yeah, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, we haven't really gotten into that yet.
Right.
So, what exactly does that mean? Cutting IDA funding?
Well, IDEA is this big law that makes sure students with disabilities have access to, a decent education.
Okay.
So we're talking specialized instruction, therapy, accommodations, whatever they need to actually learn and be successful.
Makes sense.
It's about inclusion, making sure everyone has a fair shot.
But Project 2025 sees it as, another place to save money.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Which is pretty messed up.
Yeah.
What would even happen if they cut IDA funding?
Well, schools would be in a really tough spot. They'd be struggling to provide the resources and support that these students need.
And Dr. Hoerricks brought up this, really disturbing connection to the whole history of eugenics.
Yeah. That's a really dark chapter in our history.
That's some seriously heavy stuff.
Basically, the eugenics movement thought they could, improve society by, preventing certain people from having children.
Oh, wow.
And people with disabilities were one of the groups they targeted.
It's hard to believe that kind of thinking could still be around today.
Well, it's important to remember that these ideologies don't just disappear.
That's true.
They can morph and reappear in different forms.
Yeah. So we need to be aware of that.
Definitely. We need to be vigilant and challenge those ideas whenever we see them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder about the motives behind some of these proposals. Why would anyone want to eliminate funding for schools with vaccine mandates?
Yeah, that one's a head-scratcher. Seems like it's playing politics with public health.
Right. It's are we really willing to put kids at risk just to make a point?
It's really concerning. We're talking about diseases that are completely preventable. Measles, mumps, rubella.
Polio, even.
Exactly. And it's not just about individual choice either. Vaccine mandates protect entire communities.
Especially people who can't get vaccinated for medical reasons.
Right, or babies who are too young to get the shots. It's about herd immunity.
So the more people who are vaccinated, the harder it is for these diseases to spread.
That's the idea.
But Project 2025 wants to punish schools for trying to keep their students safe.
It puts schools in a really difficult position. Do they follow the science and protect their students, or do they risk losing funding?
It's like they're being forced to choose. And
Yeah.
It seems like we keep seeing this pattern, right? Where ideologies of trumping science and common sense.
Yeah, that's a recurring theme for sure.
And then there's the whole cultural aspect of Project 2025. Dr. Hoerricks talked about how they want to control what's being taught in schools.
Oh, yeah, the curriculum battles.
Specifically when it comes to, race, gender, sexuality.
It's about controlling the narrative, deciding what stories get told and how they're told.
It feels like a huge step backward.
No.
Shouldn't we be encouraging kids to, think critically and be exposed to different perspectives?
Education should be about expanding horizons, not limiting them.
Right. But it seems like Project 2025 is trying to push a very specific worldview.
One that doesn't necessarily reflect the reality of our diverse society. And what's really troubling is that a lot of this censorship is directed at materials and discussions that focus on the experiences of marginalized communities.
It's like they're trying to erase those voices.
Exactly.
And what about teachers? It seems like all of this would make their jobs way harder.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
When you tell teachers what they can and can't teach, you create an atmosphere of fear and distrust.
It's not exactly a recipe for a good learning environment.
Not at all.
So we've talked about, schools, teachers, students.
Right.
But what does all of this mean for the future of public education?
Well, it's not a pretty picture. I mean, we could see a widening of the achievement gap,
Right.
a decline in the quality of education overall.
And more discrimination.
Definitely a possibility.
It feels like education itself is becoming this battleground for political ideologies.
It's really unfortunate.
Shouldn't we be focusing on what's best for kids?
That should be the priority, absolutely.
We need to find a way to have, real conversations about education policy without all the, fear and division.
And those conversations need to include the people who are actually affected by these decisions.
Teachers, parents, students.
Exactly. Everyone needs to have a seat at the table.
Because education is too important to mess around with.
It's the foundation of our society.
Right. We need to treat it like the investment in our future that it is.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of stuff happening at like the school and classroom level,
Mm-hmm.
but there's also this whole other layer about who actually has control over education.
The whole federal versus state thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Project 2025 is all about shrinking the role of the federal government.
Right.
But what happens when, federal policies clash with what states want to do?
That's where things could get really interesting. Remember, education in the U.S. is mostly controlled by states and local communities.
Oh, right.
So they have a lot of say in, like, setting standards and curriculum.
But the federal government still has some power, right?
They do, especially when it comes to ensuring things like civil rights and equal access to education.
So there's potential for conflict there.
Definitely.
Like, if the feds step back as much as Project 2025 wants, states are going to have to fill that void.
Right. And they might have very different ideas about how to do that.
So we could end up with this, like, patchwork of different policies across the country,
That's a real possibility. Some states might go in a more progressive direction.
while others double down on more conservative approaches.
Exactly.
And your educational opportunities could depend on, like, where you live.
That's the concern.
Dr. Hoerricks mentioned California specifically as a potential flashpoint.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, why California?
Well, California has been kind of a leader in, progressive education policy.
Okay.
They've been pushing for things like inclusive curricula, more protections for LGBTQ plus students, investing in early childhood education.
So basically the opposite of what Project 2025 wants.
Pretty much.
So this could turn into a big fight between the state and the federal government.
Oh, yeah.
Lawsuits, challenges to federal mandates.
Maybe even constitutional battles.
This is getting intense.
It's high stakes, for sure.
Like, we're deciding the future of education for, like, generations to come.
That's not an exaggeration.
Okay, so we've covered a lot today. We talked about Project 2025, what it means for schools and classrooms, the potential for, like, power struggles between states and the feds.
A lot to unpack.
So before we wrap up, what's, like, the most important thing for our listeners to understand?
I think the key takeaway is that Project 2025 is more than just, a bunch of ideas.
Right.
It's a real plan to completely change American education.
And it could have huge consequences.
Huge. It's about, moving towards more privatization, giving more control to states and local communities. And it definitely leans towards a more traditional, some might even say conservative view of what education should be.
And it's not just theoretical, right? These changes would affect everything, how schools get their money, what teachers can teach.
Yeah, real-world stuff impacting real people. Students, teachers, families, whole communities.
And the more people understand what's on the table, the better, right?
Absolutely. We need people to be aware of what's at stake so they can participate in these conversations, Advocate for the kind of education system they want for their kids, for their communities.
Because it can feel really overwhelming, right? Just trying to process all this. But knowing what's going on, that's the first step.
Exactly. Knowledge is power. We can hold our leaders accountable, push for policies that actually work, create a system that's fair for everyone.
Can't just be about, test scores or political agendas.
It's about the kids, their futures.
Education is a right, not a privilege.
That's a really important point. It's about making sure every student has the opportunity to succeed.
This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about, that's for sure.
Yeah, me too.
I'm going to be watching all this really closely, see how it plays out.
Me too. It's going to be interesting, that's for sure. And a little nerve-wracking, honestly.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, thank you so much for, walking us through all this.
Of course, anytime. It's important to talk about these things.
To our listeners, we hope this deep dive gave you like a good overview of what Project 2025 is all about.
Yeah.
But don't stop here, okay?
Keep digging.
Read that source document, Education Under Siege. Do some research on your own and talk to people.
Have those conversations.
Figure out what kind of education system you want to see.
Yeah.
And then, make your voice heard.
Exactly. Speak up, get involved.
Because like we said, the future of education is kind of in our hands.
It really is.
So that's it for this deep dive.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Stay curious, stay engaged, and we'll see you next time.